Hello and welcome. You're tuned into the best in paranormal talk radio. I'm your host, Dave Schrader, and this is Beyond the Darkness. We've got a great show lined up for you. I love looking into history, and I love revealing facts about some of our most popular historical characters that maybe others weren't aware of. When I say the name Mark Twain, immediately Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn to jump to mind, and humorist and novelist and one of the greatest American writers. But did you know that there was a supernatural side to Mark Twain? Well, our guest tonight is here to spend some time talking about that. Alan Pell Crawford is the author of Twilight at Monticello and Unwise Passions. He's a former U.S. Senate speechwriter, congressional press secretary, and magazine editor. He's reviewed books on U.S. history, politics, and culture for the Wall Street Journal since 1993, and his essays have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Nation, and elsewhere. He lives in Richmond, Virginia. His new book, How Not to Get Rich, The Financial Misadventures of Mark Twain, is out and available, and you can get it right now. As a matter of fact, if you go to darknessradio.com and click on the Killer Deals tab, it'll take you to our Amazon page. We'll have links to this book and all of the other books that you hear us mention on the show, so that way you can find it a lot easier. Go to darknessradio.com, click on the Killer Deals link. When Alan was researching this book and going through the information, he uncovered quite a bit regarding the supernatural aspect and fascination of Mark Twain. He's here to talk with us about that tonight. Thank you so much for joining us and being a part of the show this evening.
It's a great pleasure. It's always fun to talk about Mark Twain, and no matter what angle you approach it from, and he, of course, is a man of many angles.
Yeah.
One of I think that everybody loves Mark Twain. As you read these books as a child and as an adult, and one thing that if you become sort of alert to it, you find that even in the most seemingly innocuous books like Tom Sawyer, there's a kind of undercurrent of spookiness, and Huck Finn is shot full of evidently stories that Twain heard as a boy in a slaveholding community in Missouri, and where he picks up kind of Uncle Remus-like tales. He's also a superstitious boy in a deeply religious but rather unsophisticated town. So he seems to both be somewhat amused by the folklore, and yet deep down inside of him, he never quite throws it off, and is kind of haunted by this side of life himself.
Were you surprised, Alan, when you're doing research for this, and obviously you're looking at kind of a more humorous side of Twain and all of the ways he tried to get rich and failed miserably, were you surprised to start uncovering these supernatural aspects of his life and fascinations?
Well, yes. I mean, I think I was interested in Twain generally, and so I realized that the untold story of his life is the business side, and the wildly American desire he has to get rich, and how that never quite works for him despite all the money he makes as a lecturer and as a writer. But on the other hand, you as you're reading this stuff and reading more about Twain, if you're kind of interested in the paranormal and the occult and ghosts and hauntings and all of that kind of thing, and it's impossible to live in Richmond, Virginia and not be aware of all of that, then these things jump out at you throughout Twain, both in his writings and then in his life. I mean, he said his mother had second sight. He never explained quite what that meant. He was a sleepwalker as a child. I don't know the psychological what that implies. He said that his mother he went with his mother when a faith healer, a farmer's wife, cured her of a toothache by putting her hands on his mother's jaw and saying, "Believe." And he's aware of all of this stuff as a child, and even as a much older man dealing with the grief of deaths in his own family, he's kind of exploring this side of the human experience and the human condition.
Let me ask you something, if I could, before we launch into this amazing life and supernatural aspects of Twain's life. You mentioned living in Richmond, Virginia, and certainly it's rich with history and stories. Are you ever, I guess, what's the best way to put this? Are you open to the aspects of the paranormal and supernatural yourself? Is that just something that's silly, or do you see that there is something to that?
I cannot, I don't think it's silly at all. I have had no remarkable experiences in this way myself, but I am not so vain and arrogant and conceited as to dismiss the real experiences of the humans from time immemorial. I went to work out at my Y just last night, looked across the street to across the way where the Jefferson Hotel is. That's haunted. The Ellen Glasgow House is within sight there. It is haunted. The Linwood Row Hotel is haunted, and this is the old downtown area of Richmond. And, I am attracted to the writing of the American philosopher and psychologist William James, in part because he has so much respect for the experience of people, of ordinary and responsible and well-balanced people who nonetheless have experiences that defy our modernist arrogance about explaining things in a kind of rationalist way. So I go to battlefields around here which are notoriously visited by soldiers who died in 1863 or whatever, and I have yet to meet one, but my eyes are always open.
And boy, that is a rich area. I mean, certainly a lot of it. But I love the fact that you say, there's this hotel that's haunted. You just talk about it matter-of-factly, very plainly, which is kind of a refreshing aspect to hear, although you haven't had the experiences yourself.
No, but I mean, I'm aware of enough examples of that. An African-American actress, and I can't remember who it was in our town recently and stayed at the Jefferson Hotel and was visited in the night by what appeared to be an African-American servant girl or slave. And, you can't live here and not be confronted with this stuff pretty much all the time. And it's a very rich culture in that sense of a great sense of our past and the past being always present.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, you just brought up the slavery aspect of it, and Mark Twain actually grew up kind of hearing some of these ghost stories from enslaved people in town. Talk to us a little bit about that, and how did he feel about it? What was his aspect? Obviously, he was a very intelligent man. Was he as bright as a child?
Oh yeah, he for one thing, he seems to have grown up in a kind of Uncle Remus-like environment in which he could visit with enslaved people who told wonderful stories that he would later put into the character of Jim in Huckleberry Finn and that sort of thing. As a child, he's remarkably adventurous and bright and energetic, and he's always that kid that you wish you could have hung around with. Great story when he was about 14 or 15, something like that, and said, like Tom Sawyer, that he loved to be the center of attention. Hypnotist or mesmerizer came to town, and Twain paid Samuel Clemens, paid 25 cents and went night after night to watch this man, and was disappointed by the subjects who he felt were not sufficiently susceptible to hypnotism. So young Sammy himself volunteered and went on stage and tried to be hypnotized. But when he failed, he decided he would play along with the game. So for several nights running, he was the star subject of the hypnotist, who did all sorts of who would, whatever was suggested, he would take it one step farther until he was kissing girls and fishing and doing all kinds of stunts on stage, and enjoyed every minute of it. That doesn't mean that Twain didn't take this stuff on some level very seriously. And I think if I can jump ahead a bit, when he was a young riverboat pilot on the Mississippi. He had a younger brother who he adored named Henry, and he got Henry a low-level job on one of the riverboats, and they were to be on a boat called the Pennsylvania together. And Twain seems to have had a falling out with the manager or the ship's captain or whatever, and he left, and Henry went on the ship toward Memphis. And Twain had a dream a few nights after he left the ship, and he said that he saw his brother in a metal casket with a certain number, wearing a borrowed suit, and I think it was a suit of Sam Clemens' own, and that the certain arrangement of the flowers and all of this, and the dream was so vivid that he woke up and had to go outside and walk around the streets for a while to realize that it had been a dream. Of course, a day or so later, the Pennsylvania, the ship that his brother was on, exploded, as riverboats did at that time. And then he rushed to Memphis to be at his brother's bedside, and he said that everything, the funeral and all, were exactly what he had envisioned in the dream a few nights before. And this tortured Twain for the rest of his life, both the idea that if he'd been able to do something about, alerting his brother to the danger ahead, he could have saved his life, but he was also haunted by simply trying to explore and explain this uncanny experience that he had had.
That had to be heart-wrenching. I mean, to have this dream about your brother, and there's no way you can reach him. There's no way to alert anybody on that ship that there's a potential danger. And even if he could, the question is, would he have, right? I mean,
yeah.
How do you do that? What do you say?
Yeah, I had a crazy dream last night. I mean, there isn't much to do. There's not much to do until afterwards, and then it's only after the fact then that you remember the dream. We have crazy dreams all the time, and if nothing happens, if the next day, we forget the dream, and we only remember those that are remarkable in some respects, and this was a truly remarkable one. So he even went to a palm reader, I think, later in life, and another clairvoyant of some kind, trying to ask questions about this dream he had and his brother's death.
Well, speaking of dreams, let me remind everybody I'm going to be hosting Coast to Coast AM this Friday and Saturday night. Friday night, it's all about dreams. We're going to take your calls, your emails. If you're being plagued by nightmares, we want to hear your story. We've got the good doctor joining us that night. He will kind of dissect your dreams for you and help you understand not all nightmares are bad, but what happens when we keep confronting nightmare after nightmare? Can we break this cycle? What do the nightmares really mean? We'll find out all about that. And then 2 hours of open lines for the remainder of Friday night. Saturday, it's a night of ghost stories. Troy Taylor and Colin Dickey will join me throughout the evening as we hear about some of the most famous haunted locations and ghost stories in American history. That's Saturday night. And you can find times and stations in your area by visiting coasttocoastam.com. and look for the stations tab. It'll show you what stations in your area. It's on over 620 stations nationwide, so there's a way to listen, or you can listen to it right from our home studio at knSIradio.com. That's knSIradio.com, and stream the show live from their website Friday and Saturday night. When Sam Clemens, young Sam Clemens, was growing up, and he was getting these kind of Uncle Remus stories, and he would hear of the superstitions and the ghost tales and the magic, what, I don't know if you want to call it magic, witchcraft, whatever it was, of how to beat colds or warts or all of these things. Did he take them seriously, or did he just take them as part of folklore and culture at the time? Does he ever show or denote in any of his ledgers or memories how he was actually impacted by that, aside from being touched by the ideas?
Yeah, he did, and I think he was, Twain was, I think you hit on something important there when you said, did he think this was all a joke, or did he take it seriously? Well, there was almost nothing in his life or in the human condition that he didn't find amusing. But at the same time, he was a more deeply serious man, I think, than generally given credit for. I think that as I point out in the book How Not to Get Rich, this is a man for who kind of lucked into his career as a writer. This was something he told a brother that when he was out and trying to get rich in Nevada as a silver and gold miner, that he what he really wanted to do was get rich, and that he stumbled onto a career in writing because he wrote a few amusing pieces for the local newspapers, and they were wildly successful. And so he went on through the rest of his life, both trying, kind of almost grudgingly, as much as he loved writing and was almost compulsive about it, almost embarrassed sometimes. He thought he was just making a fool of himself on the lecture circuit and all of that for all the money he was making. He was just going on stage and embarrassing himself is kind of the way he sometimes viewed it. The one thing he was not able to do is, as much as seriously as he took the world of, I guess, the paranormal and the occult and all of that, as much as he took it seriously, the one thing he was never able to do was make good predictions. As I think he said that predicting is very difficult, especially with regard to the future. And if he could look into a crystal ball and find out what was going to happen, he wouldn't have lost so much money in bad investments.
Right.
But he had a sad life in some respects that I don't touch on in How Not to Get Rich, except occasionally. Like a lot of people who live to a ripe old age, as he did, you have deaths in your families. And he had a very young son who died as an infant. He had 3 daughters. 2 of them died. Only one survived into her 30s, and she died in 1962. But in the case of 2 of the daughters, he had a rather eerie experience that he told Clara, the one who did survive. The daughter died in 1909, and he went back to the house in Hartford, Connecticut, where she had died, and he said that he went into her room, and he said, "For one who does not believe in spirits, I have had a most peculiar experience. You know how warm it always is in there, and there are no drafts. All at once, I felt a cold current of air all about me. I thought the door must be open, but it was closed. I said, 'Jean,' that was the daughter who died, 'Jean, is this you trying to let me know that you have found the others?' I'm assuming there he means her mother and the other daughter and other family members. He said that you have found the others, and he said then the cold air was gone." So he has, that's an example of an actual experience that he had, besides the one of the brother dying when the Pennsylvania blew up on the Mississippi and outside Memphis. So he's got there is both not just an awareness of these things, but a positive interest in them. He's we can talk a little bit about his. I think I mentioned William James. Well, William James was one of the earliest members of the American Society for Psychical Research that was trying to look into these experiences, and Twain himself joined early. Was one of the early members who was encouraging taking this whole world of inexplicable experiences seriously and trying to conduct research into that subject. There's a wonderful book, by the way, called Ghost Hunters. It's about that period in William James' involvement in it, and does mention Twain's membership.
And so he had an active fascination and an interest in this, and certainly had some of his own experiences, although he he was still very skeptical in nature, from my understanding of the supernatural, that even though he had some weird things happen to him, he wasn't quick to jump to the idea that the supernatural was prevalent all the time. It was almost more like happenstance that these moments would occur.
Yeah, I mean, it's how this man, I was going to say conjured up, but that's probably not the best choice of words right now, but how he summoned up, that's what I meant. How he summoned up the energy to do what he did is remarkable. He as I said, he had this very active business career that was his main focus, which meant that if he's writing a book like The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, it takes him 6 years or so to write a book that he originally thought he could do in 2. He just keeps putting off to work on other things. Besides that, he's got an extraordinarily active social life. Everybody seems to love his company. I did as a writer, and I miss it, when I finished writing the book. But so he's got an active social life. When he and his wife live in Hartford, Connecticut, they are entertaining constantly, dinners and the like. And so he's got this active social life. He's also going on the lecture circuit, writing and speaking at during these travels. And he seems to have a male friend come over to the house and shoot pool all night long and smoke cigars. So he doesn't devote himself exclusively to any of this stuff. So that it isn't like he spends his life concerned with the paranormal, but at different periods it sort of comes to the surface. And I think one of the first times this happened was in 1861. This is a couple years, by the way, after Henry died in the blow-up of
after his brother died in that steamboat, right?
Yeah, and so a couple of years after that, he's a pilot, and hasn't even written anything for the newspapers. He's in New Orleans. Stopover on the New Orleans was where the ships went from New Orleans up to all the way to St. Louis, and so he's in New Orleans for a few days, and there's a very famous Madame Caprell, he says a rather pretty young woman. He says she's about 5'1", and he thinks she weighs about 96 pounds. I think he writes in the notebook her dimensions, and he says she's pretty. So he goes to her for a psychic reading, and she told him that he could make a living as a writer. She also told him that his life was surrounded. He seemed to suggest that he was making his money in some connection with the water, with the river, which in that town wasn't unusual. A lot of people did. But also she described a young woman that Twain was in love with at the time and unsuccessfully courted. Louise Wright, I believe was her name. I can't remember exactly. And he says she told this Madame Caprell told him things about his courtship of this young lady that she could not have otherwise known. And she also described the aspects of Twain's own life that he found remarkable that she would ever have known. So he writes rather amusingly about that experience. Not in I don't think any published pieces, but in private letters and journal entries and that kind of thing. And by the way, what's amazing to me, continues to amaze me about Mark Twain, is that in a lot of this stuff worked its way into my book, How Not to Get Rich. He's got an ability to toss off. I wish I could think of one right offhand, but I can't. In the most casual letter, right? I was really impressed by casual letters he would dash off from a mining camp in Nevada to his mother or something, and there'd be something in that letter that's so amusing and so right, in the kind of thing that you think of a writer like Oscar Wilde of polishing that gem just to a fare thee well, and Twain does it casually. It seems like just off the top of his head. So I think that's where the writing about Madame Caprell is in something rather casual. But 30 plus years later, he has his palm read by an Irish astrologer and palm reader who, by the way, I think this is great, who died in Hollywood. This man was an Irishman who made a lot of money reading the palms of
celebrities and movie stars, right?
Yeah. Oscar Wilde was one of them. Thomas Edison, President Grover Cleveland, and he. This man, I can't pronounce his name. It's Cheiro, Chiro, perhaps something like that. Told Twain that when he turned 68, he would become suddenly rich. And at the time that he told Twain this, I think Twain was in his mid-60s, he was $94,000 in debt, and to get a rough idea of what that would be worth in our day, you can multiply maybe by 30. So Twain was facing these crushing debts, had no idea how he was going to get out of it, and yet he was told that he was going to be rich again. And Twain wrote this, he said, "I am superstitious. I kept the prediction in mind and often thought of it. When at last it came true, October 22nd, 1903, there was but a month and 9 days to spare. On that day, he signed a new contract on his books in which the royalties from them would enable him to live a comfortable, prosperous life until he died in 1910. And at that time, there was no way he knew how he was going to get out of these debts. He developed a friendship with H. Rogers, who was a Standard Oil executive in New York, who had been a fan of Twain's from years ago. And they were introduced, and Rogers, who was a tycoon, took Twain under his wing and managed his investments and encouraged Twain to undertake at what was then the advanced age of 60, a worldwide speaking tour throughout the English-speaking world, during which he could use the profits earnings from that lecture tour was sent back to Rogers, who paid off the debtors, paid off the people that Twain owed money to, and invested the money and renegotiated the book contracts and saw through to the bankruptcy of the publishing company that Twain had started and run into the ground. And so Twain did, by the palm readers' prediction came true, remarkably enough, in a way that Twain himself could not account for. And
that's fascinating.
Yeah. And Twain says, "I'm superstitious, but he says, I can't figure this one out."
If he was so, and going back to Mark Twain here, Alan, this guy was, in your book, again, it's called How Not to Get Rich, The Financial Misadventures of Mark Twain, and it's an incredibly funny account of Mark Twain's endless attempts to strike it rich, all of which served only to end up breaking him in the end for a while. If he knew that he had gone to a medium psychic once who told him he would become a famous writer, or that he would make money being a writer, and then he met another one who was able to tell him other things and aspects about his life that was right, why didn't he speak to more psychics and mediums along the way to get advice on these financial possibilities that he looked at investing in or becoming a part of?
Well, I can offer a couple of examples. One, or possibilities. One is that he sometimes found what these psychics told him to be embarrassing to him. And he said the one who predicted he would get rich, it was the palm reader required that people who had been clients of his sign a guest book as they left. And Twain wrote that the man has exposed my character to me with humiliating accuracy. I ought not to confess this accuracy, still I am moved to do so. So apparently the psychic could tell him things about himself that embarrassed him a little bit. I'm throwing that out just as a bit of a joke, but I think that Twain was so convinced that he was going to be a great businessman that he would have considered it beneath his dignity to consult. I mean, he didn't consult too frequently, and this is, I think, part of the way business was conducted in the 1880s and 1890s, that people didn't do due diligence the way they do today. There was no way to do market research in any kind of way that you would you could draw up contracts without consulting lawyers. And so he didn't do any of that kind of thing. He would just get a crazy idea in his head and then run with it. And one of them was a baby bed clamp that he described as apparently having been the father of 4 children, he noticed that babies kicked the covers off their little beds.
Right.
And as if this was like a problem waiting to be solved, he invented a clasp of some kind that he was convinced, and he told one of the manager of his publishing company, it's like, stop worrying about books and get this thing to market. And apparently it didn't work. It ripped the sheets as well as it clamped them down. And Twain also wanted to charge more for it than the man thought was worthwhile. And the business manager said, why are we doing this? This shouldn't. He said, any reasonably intelligent adult parent could make up something just as effective on their own, with a safety pin. I mean, it just, he also got very excited about something called plasmon when he was living in Europe, where he would move the family to Europe because they could live cheaper there. And it was called plasmon, and it was some kind of food additive. And he thought this could cure the world's ills, cure poverty and hunger, and make himself a fortune. And so he spent $1.5 million or something like that for the North American rights, and was president of the American Plasmon Company, and it went bust. I mean, he gets, there's this almost a manic quality sometimes to his enthusiasms. And when you combine that with he's smarter than everybody around him in many respects. He's quicker. He's got energy. He's got vision. What's that old line from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid that I've got vision and the rest of the world wears bifocals?
Right.
I think Twain viewed it that way. So he was, for some reason, he's determined to make a lot of money. We talked a little bit about his childhood, where his mother is a very kindly and pious, and I think a woman with a great sense of humor. She seemed to have enjoyed him. His father, on the other hand, was a rather grim, dutiful, intelligent man who failed as a lawyer and failed as an innkeeper. And the one thing his father did, knowing that he wasn't going to make any money and he was leaving a family behind when he died, when he died in, I think he was in his 40s, he bought something like, it's never been determined exactly, but something like 70,000 acres out in Tennessee. And he said that when that part of the country is settled, where you guys are all going to be rich. So it doesn't matter how much I make now. I'm not making any money, but I'm leaving this inheritance to you of all this land, and if you just wait until the price is right, you'll all be rich. And Twain said that there was no curse like being prospectively rich. He said we were always going to be rich next year. So I think this, you can speak of what haunted Twain. I think this belief that they were poor now, but they'd be able to live a great life next year. He says that's a terrible curse to carry through life. And I did not attempt to explain or account for why the Twain is the way he is psychologically in the book, and I certainly don't try to get into why he believed the things he did.
Well, it's got to drive you
religious.
It had to drive you crazy, Alan, right? I mean, when you're an author who comes up with ideas and you put pen to paper, create these stories, and they're explosive and they sell and people love them, you start to buy into your own hype of all of my ideas must be this good. It had to be extremely frustrating for him to every time he put pen to paper, he could create miracles, and then he'd think, I'm going to jump on this wagon and it would crash, and I'm going to jump on this wagon and it would crash. That had to be insanely frustrating.
I think that's a very good point, and I think that not only was his writings kind of magic and had this. I think he says at one point in a slightly different context, he says everything I touch turns to gold. Well, he was not only this brilliant writer, but he was the stand-up king of his time. I mean, he was a brilliant public speaker and lecturer, and everybody else at that time seems to have been a kind of bombastic orator. Twain would shamble out on the stage and sometimes look out at the crowd and look surprised, as if, well, what are these people doing here? And then began to kind of drawl out some long-winded story, and people would begin to chuckle, and then they'd begin to laugh, and he would always look up as if he was surprised. He practiced this stuff. He was a much more practiced public speaker than writer. He cared deeply about how to do he wrote about how to use the pause in public speaking. He wrote about the craft of speaking much more than he did about writing. But so he would begin to tell some wild story, and then when people would laugh, he would look up. He would say it in a very serious way, and he would look up and as if surprised that anybody found this remotely amusing, which added to the comic effect. And so he not only could make a lot of money on the lecture circuit, but as a writer as well. But he felt that the lecture circuit was demeaning. And I can imagine that it was. You were traveling in dusty wagons and early railroads and staying in kind of shabby hotels wherever you were staying. And then, 1,000 people would show up and you'd do your dog and pony show. And I think that life on the road might have been something that B.B. King enjoyed, and some rock stars do. But I think it took a toll on Twain, and he. By the way, he not only made money, he married a very rich young woman from Elmira, New York, whose father was a coal baron, and so he not only married well, but within a year or so of his marriage, the father died, and they inherited the equivalent of $4 million.
Wow.
And she was a genteel, well-educated, progressive woman who also thought that didn't want him to be writing kind of low-rent stories like he did. And so they thought that it's interesting that his daughters and his wife seems to think that the best things he wrote were things we really don't read today because they don't hold up very well. Things like the Joan of Arc book, and he wrote Prince and the Pauper is really hard going. It's not a funny book, and people don't enjoy that one. So he was also kind of wanting a kind of bourgeois respectability that he struggled and suffered under, I think.
This is fascinating stuff. We've got more aspects of the supernatural and Mark Twain's life we will cover. Let me remind you, folks, we'll be back. We've got more of the best in Paranormal Talk Radio when we return to Beyond the Darkness. All right, we're back with our guest talking about Mark Twain, some of the weird aspects of the supernatural in his life. You were talking to me about his religious aspect at the beginning of the show, how he was brought up. But he kind of had a falling out with the church, if I understand correctly. Can you talk to me a little bit about that and this kind of sympathy for the devil that he ended up with? And I don't want to make it sound like he's a Satanist, but talk to us a little bit about that and explain that part of his history.
Sure. He grew up in a rural, small town on the Mississippi. and his in a kind of a somewhat Calvinistic Presbyterianism. His mother, as I said, was a very pious woman. She was also a light-hearted, fun-loving, somewhat of a mischievous spirit, I think, enjoyed his prankish sense of humor. But Twain was always a very questioning man, clearly. Didn't take things at face value, and if somebody told him something that he had to do or believe, he of course resisted it. And over time, if you read him, you can tell that he knows his Bible, and his trip to the Holy Land, which, by the way, there's a documentary movie on American public television that's out now about the trip to the Holy Land when he was a young reporter, which led to the huge bestseller, The Innocents Abroad, which is a great, great book. But so Twain is going to the sites of biblical history, and he's not impressed. Let's put it that way. He thinks they've turned things into tourist traps, and he can't resist making jokes. For example, one of the great scenes in the book is when he professes to weep at the grave of his great ancestor Adam. He says he's the most famous ancestor he has, and it was so great to go to another part of the world and see the grave of his ancestor Adam. So he's got this. He's also on that trip. They go to some cathedral in Italy, and they're shown a Madonna that the guide says was painted by Saint Paul, and Twain says, "Isn't it remarkable what a humble man he was? That in all of his writings he never told us he could paint." Well, so Twain his own sense of humor is scraping up against what he's supposed to believe as a good Bible-believing young man from a pious community. And over time, he finds a lot of biblical stuff to be. He can't take it seriously if it's to be rendered literally, and I don't think that the American theology had quite gotten to the point where these stories were seen often as myth rather than as historical fact. And so he brushes up against all that in the kind of Thomas Paine sort of way. He marries, as I said, a woman from a progressive, liberal Christianity in Elmira, New York, and for her sake, he became a churchgoer again. But he eventually had to tell her, I just don't believe that stuff, and it saddened him to tell her that, because he knew that he needed to be honest with her, but at the same time, over time, her faith weakened, and she kind of came to view things more as he did in that respect. And by the way, one of his two closest friends throughout his life was Joseph Twitchell, who was the pastor of the Congregational Church in Hartford, Connecticut, who had been a chaplain for the Union Army in the Civil War. Twain said at one point he was one of the best of men, although a clergyman. So Twain's own faith dissolves over his lifetime, and then the effect of the death of daughters and the death of his wife and the death of his little boy, the piling on of grief makes him increasingly convinced that life is, as he put it at one point in one of his darker moods, a great swindle. But what's remarkable, though, is his faith in the goodness of the universe, in the benevolence of God and all of that, wears away. He still has a great sense of wickedness and evil, and he writes sympathetically of Satan, not certainly in what we would call satanic or Satan worshiping. There was nothing like that. He didn't fall away from one religious dogma to embrace another one. But he says he always. In fact, one of his friends, I'm trying to think who it was, said that it was his biographer Albert Bigelow Payne said that Twain always, and I'm quoting here, always had a friendly feeling towards Satan, at least as he conceived him. And he said that the Satan that Twain thought, I think in part in a kind of postmodern way, I think Twain saw Satan as a great literary character. And he says that, Payne says that Satan was not wicked, but only indifferent to good and evil and suffering because he had no personal knowledge of any of these things. And so there's the story of the mysterious stranger about a young, charismatic boy who shows up in this town, and the other boys like to be with him, and they find him exciting and fun, and he can do tricks and things like that. But at the same time, he could be cruel, and he's cruel not because he wants to be evil or bad, but because he has no experience of good and evil. And so Twain is working through all of this stuff throughout his life, the complexity of the how deep and it was almost Freudian, I think, in the sense that Twain had an early sense of how immensely complicated our psychologies are, and how much stuff is kind of dark things are kind of buried. And Twain had a kind of courage and character to a bravery to kind of look at this aspect of life and wrestle with it forthrightly. I mean, having written How Not to Get Rich, which is some people read it and they think, how could this man be so stupid with all these bad business decisions? And I look at it and I think, how could this man have such irrepressible spirit that he could endure one setback after another and never lose his sense of humor and never lose his sense of adventure and possibility? And so I think Twain's character is just remarkably deep and rich, and for that reason he can look at the darker aspects of life and get up the next day and smoke a cigar and play pool and have a good time with his friends. He's just a wonderfully complicated man who does not shy from how weird and absurd and dark our own lives can be.
That is just an amazing part of his whole life, right? This guy faced a lot of dark and a lot of loss, yet he remained funny, he remained intelligent, he remained centered. And maybe you see the madness in the how to get rich aspects then. Maybe that's what kept his mind whirling to keep it out of the dark depths that most of us would succumb to, is he just always tried to keep the wheels going and always keep moving forward no matter what, because that was better than stopping, stagnating, or wishing he had made a move, right?
Yeah, I think there's always he's always got the next great project in sight. And the next possibility. And I think that's one of the things that makes him so wonderfully American is this tremendous sense of possibility. I mean, he believes he might be, some people might think he's gullible, but it's just he has a richer, both I've read once that what really separates the really, truly, stupendously rich people is their ability to their bravery and their times when they have to risk everything. And Twain was that kind of man. Twain would risk everything. I'm not courageous that way. I'm not. I mean, I don't have that kind of confidence and bravura to put everything on the line. And Twain would do it repeatedly and then somehow work his way back. And it's a great, enriching adventure, his life. And I'd like to say that, he did rebuild his fortunes, and he lived a comfortable old age, and with friends and a surviving daughter, and there were complications in his old age, as there are with most people who, death claims us all, but there was he remained a beloved person that we all love. I mean, it's impossible not to love Mark Twain. If you find somebody that doesn't love Mark Twain, I don't want to know him.
Right. I agree with you completely. It's fascinating. The book is called How Not to Get Rich, The Financial Misadventures of Mark Twain. Very funny, very good book, folks. Pick it up, read it for yourself. We got an aspect of a life of Mark Twain that is not in these books, talking about his supernatural, affinity and his interest in the paranormal and future. And it's been such a pleasure talking with you, Alan, and we'd love to have you back with us on the show sometime.
Thank you, Dave. It's been fun.
It's always great. And thank you all for tuning in and being part of the show with us. Remember, if you're listening to us on iTunes, do us a favor, go rate Beyond the Darkness. Just go give us the 5 stars. I mean, you could screw around at 4, I guess, but stick with the 5. Why not? It doesn't cost you an extra penny to throw that 5 in there. So go ahead and give us 5 stars, rate it, give us a little review on there so that we can push our numbers up and let this be seen by more people through iTunes. Continue to spread the good news of the Army of Darkness. And when you read books, like our guest's book tonight, How Not to Get Rich, The Financial Misadventures of Mark Twain, make sure that you go rate their books, because those ratings are very important in this realm, people, especially when you like things. Let the world know about it. We have enough negativity in the world. Go rate things that you love so that other people can find it. And instead of focusing on the negativity in life, we can focus on the good things. And maybe if we all start focusing on the good things and involving ourselves more in the good things and the fun, we'll all have a better time in life. So take that to heart. We'll be back again tomorrow with more of the best in paranormal talk radio and a brand new edition of Theater of the Mind right here on Beyond the Darkness.